Welcome back to From VHS Horror Rentals to Modern Remakes, Part 2. In the world of horror, nothing stays buried for long. When the classics of the VHS era started haunting new generations, studios lined up to resurrect them, some with respect, others with reckless abandon. From haunted houses and apocalyptic outbreaks to masked killers and suburban nightmares, these remakes prove that horror's past is always waiting to be rediscovered and reimagined. Let's take another trip down the rewind lane and see which of these modern versions managed to recapture the fear, and which ones lost it in translation. Dawn of the Dead, 1978, remade as Dawn of the Dead, 2004. Before the 2004 remake turned it into a high-speed zombie spectacle, Dawn of the Dead from 1978 was the real deal. One of the most important and influential horror films ever made. Written and directed by George A. Romero, it wasn't just a zombie movie. It was the zombie movie that defined what the genre would become. Set during the early days of a worldwide undead outbreak, the story follows 4 survivors, 2 SWAT members, a TV reporter, and a traffic pilot, who barricade themselves inside a massive shopping mall to escape the chaos. Inside, they find everything they need: food, safety, comfort, and eventually, the realization that the mall itself is a trap. Not because of the zombies, but because of what it represents. Dawn of the Dead isn't just about survival. It's about consumerism, emptiness, and how even at the end of the world, people still try to find meaning through the things they own. It's a sharp social critique wrapped in a wall of practical effects and buckets of blood, all brought to life by the genius of Tom Savini, whose work here became the gold standard for zombie makeup. On VHS, Dawn of the Dead was sacred text. Horror fans passed it around like contraband. The unrated version was harder to find, but it was the one everyone wanted, the one that pushed the limits. The mall setting, the synth score, the bleak humor, it all came together into something that still feels fresh decades later. The 2004 remake, directed by Zack Snyder, surprised everyone by being genuinely solid. It updated the story for a new era, traded slow-moving zombies for sprinting ones, and added modern chaos and tension. But for all its polish, it couldn't touch the atmosphere of Romero's original, that eerie stillness, the empty mall echoing with consumer ghosts. The 1978 Dawn of the Dead is more than a horror film. It's a time capsule of American culture, a brutal reflection of who we were and maybe who we still are. It's smart, bloody, and oddly beautiful, the kind of movie that earns its place on every VHS shelf. And while the remake may have the action, the original has the soul. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. Remade as The Hills Have Eyes, 2006. Before the 2006 remake cranked up the gore and special effects, The Hills Have Eyes started life as a grim little shocker from Wes Craven back in 1977, a brutal, sand-blasted survival film that felt like it was dragged straight out of the American wasteland. Craven wrote it after Last House on the Left, determined to prove that terror didn't have to come from ghosts or monsters. It could come from people pushed too far. The movie follows a suburban family whose RV breaks down in the desert, only to be stalked by a clan of feral cannibals living in the surrounding hills. There's no safety, no rescue, just sun-bleached dread and raw desperation. Shot on a shoestring budget in the Mojave, the film's grit became its identity. The camera feels dusty, the violence feels personal, and the desert itself becomes a character, endless, merciless, and hungry. Craven used that emptiness to strip away civilization, turning an ordinary family into savages fighting back to survive. When The Hills Have Eyes hit VHS in the 1980s, it spread like an urban legend. The cover art alone, sun-baked skulls, crazed eyes, and cracked earth, promised something nasty, and the movie delivered. It was banned, censored, and whispered about in the same breath as Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I Spit on Your Grave. The 2006 remake, produced by Alexandre Aja and Wes Craven himself, stayed surprisingly faithful to the original story while amping up the visual horror. The mutants were grotesque, the violence relentless, and the scale much larger. But even with the upgrades, it couldn't replicate the raw, unpredictable terror of Craven's 1977 vision. The original looked like it could collapse at any moment, and that instability made it real. The Hills Have Eyes wasn't just another 70s exploitation movie. It was a scream from the dark side of the American dream, a warning that when civilization breaks down, the difference between us and the monsters in the hills might not be that wide. And more than 40 years later, that scream still echoes through the desert. Flatliners, 1990. Remade as Flatliners, 2017. Before the 2017 remake tried to resurrect it with a new cast and a fresh coat of digital polish, Flatliners from 1990 was a sleek, ambitious mix of sci-fi, horror, and philosophy. The kind of glossy, high-concept thriller that defined the tail end of the VHS era. Directed by Joel Schumacher, the original follows a group of medical students obsessed with the question of what happens after death. They devise an experiment to flatline themselves, stopping their hearts for a few minutes before being revived, and soon discover that what they bring back isn't just knowledge, but guilt, trauma, and something that may not want to stay dead. Starring Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Kevin Bacon, and William Baldwin, Flatliners had the look and sound of early 90s big studio horror. Foggy corridors, flashing medical equipment, echoing voices, and that ethereal electronic score. It was stylish, eerie, and perfectly balanced between science fiction and supernatural punishment. On VHS, Flatliners was a must-rent title. It felt futuristic but human, a morality tale about playing God, wrapped in the visual language of a neon fever dream. Schumacher filled the frame with color and shadow, giving it that heightened sense of reality that only 90s thrillers had. The 2017 remake tried to recapture that energy with new faces and modern effects, even bringing Sutherland back in a cameo. But the original's strength wasn't its concept. It was its mood. The remake explained too much. The 1990 version thrived on mystery. You didn't need to understand the afterlife, you just needed to feel it breathing down your neck. The original Flatliners remains a fascinating time capsule of when horror was turning high-tech. A film that asked what lies beyond death, and, more importantly, what we drag back with us when we cross the line. It's part ghost story, part science experiment, and all atmosphere. The kind of movie that lived on late-night shelves for years after its release, glowing with that same electric energy every time you pressed play. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Remade as A Nightmare on Elm Street, 2010. Before the 2010 remake tried to give Freddy Krueger a darker origin story, A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984 was already the stuff of legend. A surreal, terrifying dreamscape that turned sleep itself into the enemy. Written and directed by Wes Craven, the original follows a group of teenagers in suburban Springwood who begin dying in their dreams. Stalked by a burned man with a bladed glove who can kill them in their sleep. His name was Freddy Krueger, and once you saw him, you never forgot him. What made Elm Street stand apart wasn't just Freddy, it was the concept. Craven turned the familiar rhythms of slasher horror into something supernatural and psychological. Reality bent, walls pulsed, bathtubs came alive. Every scene felt like falling into a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. And unlike Jason or Michael, Freddy talked. He taunted. He was evil with a personality, a boogeyman who knew he was performing for an audience. When it hit home video, A Nightmare on Elm Street became a phenomenon. Teens passed around copies like urban legends, daring each other to stay awake. The special effects, done with practical ingenuity, were both imaginative and grotesque. It didn't just scare, it entertained. It was the perfect mix of terror and twisted fun that defined 80s horror at its peak. The 2010 remake, directed by Samuel Bayer, went for a darker, more grounded approach. Jackie Earle Haley stepped into Freddy's burned skin with menace and sorrow, more monster than showman. The movie leaned into realism, exploring trauma and repressed memory, but lost the surreal spark that made the original unforgettable. It looked slick. It sounded modern, but it felt safe. as if it had forgotten that nightmares are supposed to be unpredictable. The 1984 original remains the definitive version because it understood fear as imagination, not just violence. It made the impossible feel real and the ordinary feel dangerous. A Nightmare on Elm Street was like watching a bad dream recorded on tape, a movie that refused to end when you hit stop. The Crazies, 1973, remade as The Crazies, 2010. Before the slick 2010 remake turned it into a modern viral outbreak thriller, The Crazies began as a low-budget nightmare from George A. Romero back in 1973 is a film that blurred the line between horror and social commentary, just like he did with Night of the Living Dead. The story starts in a small Pennsylvania town that suddenly descends into chaos after a military plane crashes nearby, contaminating the water supply with a biological weapon called Trixie. Within hours, the residents start losing their minds, laughing, screaming, turning violent. And before anyone knows what's happening, the army moves in to contain it. What follows isn't just a horror movie about infection, but a paranoid look at how authority handles panic. Romero shot The Crazies like a war documentary. It's handheld, frantic, full of military radio chatter, white hazmat suits, and citizens caught in the crossfire. It's messy, chaotic, and angry. Beneath the horror lies Romero's real theme: how quickly society collapses when fear and confusion take over. When The Crazies hit VHS in the 80s, it developed a small but loyal following. It wasn't flashy, but it felt real in a way few horror films did. The 2010 remake, directed by Breck Eisner, took Romero's blueprint and turned it into a polished, adrenaline-fueled contagion thriller. It had slick cinematography, strong performances, and a heavier focus on infection horror. More Outbreak meets Dawn of the Dead. But even with the upgrade in visuals and pacing, it lost a bit of that raw, chaotic tension Romero captured with almost no resources. What makes the 1973 original worth revisiting isn't just its message or its grit. It's how eerily relevant it still feels. Government cover-ups, misinformation, and fear spreading faster than any virus. Romero saw it all coming decades before we lived it. The Crazies may not be his most famous film, but it's one of his sharpest, and on VHS it still hits like a fever dream that never really broke. The Haunting, 1963, remade as The Haunting, 1999. Before the 1999 remake turned it into a digital effects showcase, The Haunting from 1963 was one of the most quietly terrifying ghost stories ever filmed, a masterclass in suggestion and psychological dread that proved you don't need to see the monster to feel it breathing down your neck. Directed by Robert Wise and based on Shirley Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House, the original follows a small group of people invited to a mysterious mansion by a paranormal investigator. Among them is Eleanor, a fragile woman whose loneliness seems to make her particularly sensitive to whatever is lurking inside. The film never shows a ghost outright, yet every sound, shadow, and creaking wall feels alive, as if the house itself is watching. Wise use sound, silence, and shadow like weapons. The camera tilts at impossible angles, the walls seem to breathe, and the atmosphere is suffocating. There's a sadness that runs through it, a sense that The Haunting isn't just supernatural, but emotional. When it hit VHS, The Haunting felt timeless. The black and white imagery and lack of jump scares made it stand out in a sea of louder horror movies. It wasn't about shocks. It was about the slow erosion of sanity, a ghost story that whispered instead of screamed. The 1999 remake, directed by Jan de Bont, took the same premise and blew it up into a Hollywood spectacle. The cast was stacked: Liam Neeson, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Owen Wilson, and the mansion was a Baroque nightmare of CGI corridors and towering statues. But where the original relied on atmosphere, the remake went for size. The ghosts were visible, the scares exaggerated, and the story reimagined as a dark fairy tale. It's grand, loud, and over-designed, but there's a strange charm in its excess, a reflection of the late 90s fascination with technology and spectacle. The house isn't subtle anymore. It's a character made of pixels and marble. And while it can't match the tension of Wise's version, it's an interesting echo. The same story told through a completely different lens. The original haunting is quiet horror at its purest, the kind that gets under your skin and stays there. The remake is its loud, glittering shadow, proof that you can rebuild Hill House as many times as you want. But the real terror will always live in the silence between knocks. The 1963 Haunting was a ghost story you didn't just watch. You felt it in every creak, every whisper, every dark corner you tried not to look at. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Remade as The Last House on the Left, 2009. Before the 2009 remake tried to make it slick and cinematic, The Last House on the Left was one of the most shocking and controversial horror films of the early 1970s, a raw, angry debut from Wes Craven that tore the line between exploitation and social commentary to shreds. The story is simple and devastating. Two teenage girls head into the city for a concert, but they're abducted by a gang of criminals who subject them to brutal violence before fleeing into the woods, unaware that the house they hide in belongs to the parents of one of their victims. What follows is vengeance, but not the kind that feels triumphant. Craven turns the revenge plot inside out, forcing viewers to question who the real monsters are once civility is gone. Made on a micro-budget and shot like a documentary, the film feels disturbingly real. The handheld camera work, awkward cuts, and gritty sound make it look less like a movie and more like found footage from a nightmare. Even its awkward tonal shifts, moments of dark humor mixed with unbearable cruelty, only make it more unsettling. The Last House on the Left became one of those legendary banned in some countries titles. It passed from hand to hand, wrapped in rumors about cuts, censorship, and missing footage. To some, it was a piece of shock trash. To others, it was a mirror of a violent, disillusioned America still haunted by Vietnam. The 2009 remake gave the story a glossy new coat, better acting, beautiful cinematography, and Hollywood pacing, but it couldn't recapture the grime and chaos of Craven's original. The new version tried to make the revenge satisfying. The 1972 version wanted it to hurt. It's not an easy film to revisit, but it's one that defined an entire corner of horror. The uncomfortable, uncompromising kind that holds your face to the ugliness of human nature. In the VHS era, The Last House on the Left wasn't just another horror movie on the shelf. It was the one people warned you about. The Omen, 1976, remade as The Omen, 2006. Long before the 2006 remake tried to modernize its prophecy with digital polish and familiar scares, the original The Omen from 1976 was one of the most chilling and elegant studio horror films ever made. A perfect blend of prestige, cinema, and pure nightmare fuel. Directed by Richard Donner and carried by a haunting performance from Gregory Peck, the film tells the story of an American diplomat who gradually realizes that his adopted son might be the Antichrist. It's a slow, deliberate descent into dread, full of ominous coincidences, cryptic warnings, and deaths that feel too orchestrated to be random. What sets it apart is its tone. Calm, composed, and unnervingly confident in its own evil. The movie's power came from suggestion as much as shock. Composer Jerry Goldsmith's Oscar-winning score, all Latin chants, and apocalyptic fury, gave the film an unholy weight. Every scene feels cursed, from the chilling "It's all for you, Damien" sequence to the decapitation that set new standards for practical effects in mainstream horror. The Omen was terrifying not because it screamed, but because it whispered, convincing you that evil could hide behind the face of an innocent child. When The Omen was remade in 2006, director John Moore stayed almost obsessively faithful to the original, down to recreating entire scenes shot for shot. The release date, June 6, 2006, was clever marketing. But beyond that novelty, the new version struggled to justify its existence. Liev Schreiber and Julia Stiles give strong performances, but the remake loses the quiet menace that made the 1976 film feel biblical in scale. The original remains one of the crown jewels of 1970s studio horror. Stylish, serious, and unforgettable. On home video, The Omen felt like forbidden scripture, a prophecy you weren't supposed to witness, yet couldn't look away from once it began. The Stepfather, 1987. Remade as The Stepfather, 2009. Before the glossy 2009 remake turned it into a standard suburban thriller, The Stepfather from 1987 was a sharp, unsettling slice of psychological horror that tapped directly into the anxieties of the late 80s American dream. Directed by Joseph Rubin and written by Donald E. Westlake, the film follows Jerry Blake, played perfectly by Terry O'Quinn, a man obsessed with the idea of the perfect family. He moves from town to town, marrying widows or single mothers, and when the illusion of his ideal life inevitably cracks, he murders everyone and starts again. The brilliance of The Stepfather lies in its restraint. There are no monsters, no supernatural twists, just an ordinary man with an extraordinary delusion. O'Quinn plays Jerry with unnerving charm. Polite, helpful, even lovable at first glance. But when that mask slips, you see the horror underneath. The rage, the control, the madness of a man trying to live inside his own fantasy. On VHS, this one spread quietly, often mistaken for a drama at first glance. But word of mouth gave it cult status, especially for its infamous line, "Who am I here?" right before Jerry snaps. It became the kind of movie passed between horror fans who appreciated suspense over splatter. The 2009 remake tried to modernize the story with cell phones, security cameras, and a younger cast, but it lost the subtle tension that made the original so chilling. The remake was slick and competent, but The Stepfather from 1987 had something you can't fake, a creeping sense that evil doesn't always come from outside the home. Sometimes it's the man sitting across the breakfast table, smiling, waiting for everything to fall apart. It's a quiet horror film, but one that lingers. And on VHS, The Stepfather felt almost too real. Like a warning that behind every white picket fence, something dark might be waiting for dinner. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976, remade as The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 2014. Before the 2014 meta-sequel tried to blend homage with modern slasher tropes, The Town That Dreaded Sundown from 1976 was a chilling piece of Southern Gothic horror, a film that blurred the line between fact and fiction long before true crime became a genre. Directed by Charles B. Pierce, the movie is loosely based on the real-life Texarkana moonlight murders of 1946, a series of unsolved killings that left a quiet border town paralyzed with fear. It follows a hooded killer, known only as the Phantom, who preys on young couples in the night, while local law enforcement scrambles to stop him before he strikes again. What made the original Town That Dreaded Sundown so unnerving wasn't just the story. It was how real it felt. Pierce shot on location in Texarkana, using natural light, real residents, and the dusty rural atmosphere of the American South. It feels half documentary, half nightmare, narrated with a folksy tone that only makes the violence more jarring. The Phantom's bag-headed figure, silent, emotionless, brutal, would later inspire slashers like Jason Voorhees and The Killers of the Strangers. For a 1970s horror film, it's remarkably restrained. The violence isn't sensationalized. It's cold and matter-of-fact, making the fear feel closer to home. And that's what gives it power. This isn't a story about a supernatural monster. It's about a real community haunted by something they couldn't understand or control. When it hit VHS in the 80s, The Town That Dreaded Sundown became a cult hit, often passed around by horror fans who couldn't believe it was based on true events. The grain and flicker of the tape gave it an even more disturbing edge, as if you were watching evidence from a case file that never closed. The 2014 remake took an interesting approach, not quite a reboot, not quite a sequel, set in the same town decades later, where the movie itself exists within the story. It's a clever concept, and visually stylish, but it lacks the eerie, grounded realism that made the 1976 original feel so unique. That first version still feels dangerous, like something that slipped through the cracks of studio polish and urban myth. On VHS, it looked like a ghost story told through static and silence. one that still echoes after the screen goes dark. Some remakes manage to breathe new life into familiar terrors, while others remind us that the magic of the originals can't be replicated. But whether you saw them on a flickering CRT or in a packed theater, each one shows just how deeply these stories have rooted themselves in horror history. If you missed part 1, make sure to check it out. And stay tuned, because part 3 is on the way with even more reborn nightmares from the VHS era. And remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.